So eventually, the goal for this channel is to stream these types of conversations. But for right now, when I don't have like a video game playing in the background, or a Discord call, or a video up that I'm reviewing, I just made a slideshow so we can follow along to what the conversation is about today, which is the myth of anti-white racism and how we should combat it. So let's start with the main issue. Is racial prejudice a form of racism? Yes. Duh. Let's take that logic a step further, though. Is racial prejudice against white people a form of racism? Technically, I mean, it's not really what the conversation we're having is about, and that's not really why this is such a controversial issue. In order to get into that, let's go over a few basic terms. Internalized racism is the type of racism that comprises our private beliefs and biases about race and racism. These are things that we absorb from our environments, from our communities, and society at large. Even marginalized people can internalize biases about their own communities, such as internalized racism, internalized homophobia, internalized misogyny, etc. Interpersonal racism refers to the bias that occurs when individuals interact with others, and their personal racial beliefs affect their public interactions. These actions may be influenced by systemic factors, but interpersonal racism is not the same as systemic racism. Examples of interpersonal racism in the day-to-day might include like being called mean names, being called slurs, or being treated unfairly by someone you know, like friends or family. Systemic racism refers to a very different type of racism. This is the unfair policies and discriminatory practices of particular institutions, like schools and workplaces, that routinely produce racially inequitable outcomes for people of color and advantages for white people. Typically, when people are criticizing forms of systemic racism, it refers to the criminal justice system. And examples that we see in the day-to-day are people of color, for example, being denied access to essential needs, such as housing, employment, healthcare, etc., or being more likely to be convicted of a crime or receive harsher sentencing from that conviction than others who also commit the same crime with the same priors. So why is racism against white people such a common talking point? Well, what sociologists and civil rights advocates refer to when they discuss racism is systemic racism. They are not discussing interpersonal racism. But what happens when such people who want to address these issues bring up those issues? White people can experience racism too. Equivocating these issues demonstrates one of two things. One, they don't understand the complexities of these issues and why their argument is flawed. Or two, they are completely full of shit and are just trying to attempt to justify racism. White people can experience interpersonal racism in the form of racial prejudice. That much is true. But people of color can also experience interpersonal racism in the form of racial prejudice, as well as experiencing systemic racism that white people do not. So why would people intentionally make this argument when it's complete bullshit? Because redirecting discussions about systemic racism onto the experiences of white people is what racists do. They do not want us to be having conversations about the experiences of people of color or the way that systemic racism impacts them. So the more the conversation is centered around the experiences of white people, the less time we actually get to spend addressing not only the interpersonal but the systemic issues that people of color face. And largely, it is white people who do this, but to be fair, it is entirely possible for people of color who have internalized racism to reinforce and defend institutional power that has largely affected them and their communities. So how do we combat this? Well, for starters, stop indulging these deflections. Point out the difference between interpersonal racism and systemic racism and redirect the conversation back to the actual issues. Does this mean that we need to recognize racial prejudice against white people as a form of racism? Yes. While the racism we are discussing is composed of prejudice and power, and prejudice against white people is admittedly not backed by institutional power, obviously, allowing conversations to constantly be diverted to anti-white racism is exactly what those obstructing progress want. So we need to spend less time doing so and indulging these bullshit conversations, and instead redirect our focus at addressing systemic racism and producing more positive outcomes. But what happens if we make this concession, however bullshit it is? Well, they have no counter-arguments. How are they going to counter the fact that people of color not only experience interpersonal racism, which white people can also experience, but also they experience systemic racism that white people don't, because that is the core of the argument we're making. And if they can't divert the conversation to the experiences of white people, they don't have any better arguments to address the empirical and historical evidence that we have that objectively and inarguably proves the existence of systemic racism. And usually, the only people who continue to argue that white people are the ones who are really oppressed in America out themselves as white supremacists. So, what happens if I do encounter a white supremacist who attempts to deny the existence of systemic racism or insist that it's actually white people who experience systemic racism? Well, in a casual setting, run. Don't walk. Prioritize yourself and your own safety. You're not obligated to entertain these people. In a professional setting, like in a workplace or as part of an organization, you should get in contact with whatever entity is responsible for keeping that professional setting safe and accountable, and let them know that they need to take action immediately. You should not tolerate white supremacists in professional settings in which people could get hurt. And on the public stage, what happens if you encounter a white supremacist? You should mock them. They obviously aren't arguing in good faith, so let them make a fool of themselves to the public and emphasize why their beliefs are worthy of ridicule. Now, I know what the next point is going to be is, no, you really shouldn't be debating white supremacists, so I'm going to follow up on that. Should I go out of my way to platform white supremacists? Is that what I'm advocating for right now? Hell no! Please don't. However, because we live in America, sometimes white supremacists find a way to have a platform whether you want them to or not. And in those instances, our best weapon is public shaming. They may have the legal right to free speech, meaning that the state cannot legally censor them. But that does not mean that the public, us, must tolerate their hateful and dangerous rhetoric. What if I am not overly knowledgeable on these complex topics? That's completely fine. You don't have to be. You don't need to know how to debunk every conspiracy theory or argument made by white supremacists. God knows there are a billion of them. You also don't need to know every little detail on how to solve issues of systemic racism. It's a complex issue. You just need to make it clear that their hateful rhetoric against people of color and reinforcing the idea of white supremacy will not be tolerated. That's it. That's all you have to do. You can just vaguely gesture at the fact that white supremacy is bad, and when they try and put the burden of proof on you to justify white supremacy is bad, you don't need to. Just tell them to shut the fuck up and that they don't have a space there. That's all you have to do. And if everyone did that, they wouldn't be able to speak anywhere, ever. And that's exactly the type of America that we need to live in. Is it better to know how to address these issues? Absolutely. But like many things in the United States, knowledge is not distributed equally. I would encourage everyone who is listening to this video right now, who is interested, to look into these issues more, as there are experts and advocates that have been pushing for systemic changes for generations. I would say, as an entry-level thing, most people know about Martin Luther King Jr., but they only know a whitewashed version of what he advocated for. They only know about the I Have a Dream speech. They've never actually read like a letter to Birmingham jail or listened to his later speeches he gave about the radical distribution of wealth being necessary to the liberation of people of color. Most people don't know about Malcolm X. They should look into Malcolm X. Most people don't know about Angela Davis. They should look into Angela Davis. She intersects not just the liberation of people of color, but also immigrants and the liberation of the working class, that sort of thing. There's a number of people that you can look into. It's all out there. Everyone starts somewhere. It's okay if you're only starting now, but it's important for you to remember that anti-racism is not a destination. It's a constant practice. It's something that you need to do throughout your entire life actively. It's not a place that you can arrive at. It's not an endpoint or a goal. It's something that you need to continuously check yourself and make sure you are engaging in at all times, because we're never going to live in a world that is completely devoid of racism. And the last thing I want to talk about is why did I include so many slides about engaging with white supremacists? It's because white supremacy is more prevalent in America than most people are willing to admit. Just talk to literally any conservative about the Black Lives Matter movement.